Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to the AIVC for the opportunity to speak to you all today. The title of my talk is Disability Adjusted Life Years, or known as DALYs, as an integrated indoor air quality metric of harm. I'm not going to spend the next 20 minutes talking exclusively about DALYs. I'm going to tell you about DALYs for sure, but I'm going to tell you about a journey to arriving at DALYs. So I want to start with a brief thought experiment. I want you to consider two people occupying the same room. One might be 8 years old and one might be 80 years old. So they're two people doing different activities. So the 8-year-old's running around as 8-year-olds do, and the 8-year-old is a little more sedentary, as 8-year-olds tend to be. So they also have different ages, as you will have noticed. But assuming they're exposed to exactly the same air for the same period of time, which person is harmed the most? So we'll come back to that at the end of the talk. I want to remind you where we are at the moment. And we currently exist in an olfactory paradigm. And I've always liked Andy Pasili's 2006 paper called What We Think We Know About Ventilation, where he talks about the origin of the 10 litres per second per person ventilation rate, which was first codified maybe around 1989, where he notes that the minimum ventilation requirement of 7.5 litres per second, which is based on body odour control, was increased to 10 litres per second in many building types to account for contaminants other than bioeffluents, such as building materials and furnishings, though no specific methodology for determining the increase is noted. So just to be clear, there is no scientific basis that underpins the 10 litres per second per person. We've taken 7.5 litres per second because it gets rid of the smells from people. We've sort of rounded it up a bit to account for other things, and it's a nice round number that people can remember. There is no scientific basis for it. So given that we know that there are pollutants in the indoor air and that some of them can be harmful to us, how do we go about thinking about indoor air quality? Well, the AIVC ran a workshop in 2017 in Brussels, and we started to look at a few different mechanisms for considering indoor air quality. The first was perceived air quality, which has major limitations. So it's maybe good as a rule of thumb. We know that if you go into a room and it smells bad, then it's almost certain that it's underventilated. But you can't, for example, smell some pollutants such as carbon monoxide. So how do you deal with that? Then we might want to consider a rating system. So it might be a sort of tick box approach where you go around a building and you identify different criteria and tick them off, and so each feature then might be weighted according to their hazard and then aggregated to produce a single metric. So the method could be used to develop a third-party rating system similar to many existing energy rating schemes that are present in most developed countries today. And an example here is the WELL standard, and so this may be helpful to someone who's sensitive to specific contaminants or to home bias. But it won't necessarily tell you if you have certain features, how much the health or what the reduction in harm is to the occupants of that building. So, for example, with the WELL standard, I'm not quite sure what you get from going to silver to gold to platinum, apart from a different coloured piece of foil in the corner of your certificate, and probably a bigger check or bill. Then Mark has mentioned sub-indices to us, which I'll, sorry, he hasn't mentioned. He mentioned exposure limit to values. I'll come on to those in a minute. But sub-indices, then you might measure a range of pollutants to gain a comprehensive picture. But then again, how many pollutants is enough? How much can you afford to measure? And then you have problems of scaling them. So not all pollutants are measured using the same units. You've got those for radon, so becquerels, and then particulates perhaps with micrograms per meter cube. So how do you bring those together? Well, you have to think of a way of doing that. So you then might convert into a sub-index, perhaps as a function of their health risk. But when you combine them all into a single measure, it is firmly subjective. And averages, as Mark mentioned, can lead to situations where all pollutants are deemed acceptable, but the final result shows exceedance, or the opposite, where situations where a final index indicates acceptable air quality when one or more of the indices are greater than their individual thresholds, which is almost certainly unacceptable, particularly if they're dangerous in the short term. So the summing of all indices does not necessarily indicate overall air quality. An example of a sub-index is TVOC, and as a friend of mine called them recently, a random number generator. Exposure limit values then are, as Mark mentioned, used in the occupational environment. So for example, to reduce risks of health from hazards such as vibration. So if you're using a vibrating machine, there's a limit to the amount of time you can use it before one expects health issues to occur. So you set a maximum quantity experienced per person per day, and this could be applied when measuring the concentrations of a range of contaminants in a building. And then we take the ratio of their maximum concentrations to their respective exposure limit value concentrations to give a quick indication of risk. So here a ratio of less than unity might be acceptable, but one approaching unity or exceeding unity may be problematic. There are some issues. So we're going to see perhaps discussion in the health literature of thresholds and guideline values. So for example, there is a threshold for carbon monoxide whereby if you go over it, you can expect the person to die. But there are not necessarily thresholds for other pollutants such as PM2.5s because we do not necessarily know the concentration below which harm does not occur. Accordingly, we tend to set guideline values. And guideline values then for different pollutants here, PM2.5, so particulate matter with a diameter of 2.5 micrometers or less, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and ozone. They're measured over different time periods, and different organizations give different guideline values, which gives away the fact that they're subjectively set. So just a few comments then on some of these metrics which are starting to appear. So some standards are regulating air quality, generally relying at the moment on non-health-based metrics, certainly with the 10 litres per second non-evidence-based metrics. And here you might use an indicator like carbon dioxide to show whether a space is underventilated or not, or the perception of the air quality. So although threshold-based values are useful, they provide insufficient information with which to make any but the most basic judgments. They certainly don't tell us about harm. And so concentrations like, metrics like CO2 concentration or perception and so on are maybe sort of helpful in the short term, but they're only helpful in a sort of cursory way. They're not helpful necessarily in a definite way. We need to think then about the well-being of individuals, which is addressed by considering two parameters. So in the epidemiological dictionary, we call that mortality and morbidity. So that will be premature death and years of life spent with some illness attributable to exposure to indoor air pollutants. So any single summary measure of health and well-being needs to account for both morbidity and mortality. And a metric that does just this is a health-adjusted life year. So I'm going to talk now through two health-adjusted life years. You may have already guessed that one of them is DALY's. So here we have a diagram which starts from birth. It talks us through the years of life lived in full health, at which point a person contracts some illness and becomes unwell. And then they live a period of their life in reduced health. so less than optimal health, and then they perhaps die early from the disease. So the blue block on the right then indicates the years of their life which they have lost because they have contracted the illness. So the ideal life expectancy, which is I think about 80 years for a man or 82.5 for a woman, is the full extent of the bar, but if somebody has contracted an illness, they tend to die early. So a HALI then is a population health summary measure typically used in estimates of burden of disease, population scale, particularly those, for example, given in the Lancet where they use DALYs. They measure the combined effect of mortality and morbidity in populations. So just going to, two acronyms you need to hold in your head as we go forward. YLL is years of life lost, and YLD is years of life with disability. So there are two key health adjusted life year metrics in use today. The first is the QALY and the second is the DALY, and different organizations and different countries and different organizations within countries tend to use one or the other, do use one or the other. And for example, the UK National Health Service uses the QALY, and I believe similar organisations in the Netherlands and Thailand, for example, also use the QALY, whereas the World Health Organization uses the DALY. Now, QALY stands for Quality Adjusted Life Year, and DALY stands for Disability Adjusted Life Year. So the QALY measures the quality of life in health gain after treatment, whereas a DALY measures the health lost in the quality of life after contracting some disease. So that can be mitigated by a treatment. So the QALY accounts for years of life lived, where the DALY accounts for years of life lost. So the QALY does not necessarily measure specific health outcomes. It talks more about change in the quality of life, whereas the DALY does measure specific health outcomes. So you can have several health outcomes from exposure to a single indoor air pollutant, and these would be simply added together when using the DALY. So the QALY then allows us to measure the effectiveness of an intervention by increasing the quality of life, whereas the DALY allows us to measure the effectiveness of an intervention at reducing the disease burden due to a condition. So the advantage of both of them, or the good thing about both of them, is that you can put an economic value at a national level, and the UK does this, and I'll show you how the UK does this in a bit with QALYs. Whereas with DALYs, there has not yet been it has not yet been allocated to economic values at national level, and so it has this disadvantage at the moment. Okay, so let's consider the QALY then. So on the y-axis, you have quality of life, which is given by a number between 0 and 1, and QALY then considers the years of life lived in full health before life years lived with the condition occur at some point in time. It stops counting then when the person dies. So it provides a comprehensive measure of health in social well-being and physical health dimensions by combining both quality of life and quantity of life. So I want to go through a quick economic example here. So let's say that a person contracts some illness and they're given 2 different treatments. So this will tell us how we might work out the cost per QALY. So if the first illness leads the person to have a reduction in utility of 0.1, so their life goes down from 1 to 0.9, and the cost of their treatment is £1,500. You substitute any currency you like in here, it's not necessarily unique to pounds. So I'm sorry, I realize there's a mistake here in the plot where the first treatment is A and B are put the wrong way around. So the reduction for treatment A leads to a reduction in quality of life of a half. So 2 years of life extended at the weighting of a half gives you a QALY of 1, whereas treatment B has a cost of £100, but the quality of life is dramatically improved and gives 4 years of life with a QALY at 0.9, which gives you a weighting, a quality of life utility weighting of 0.9, which gives you a QALY value of 3.6. So the difference between the two is a cost difference. So that should be £1,000 is £500, and the difference between the QALY values is 2.6. Just going to make a quick adjustment to my slide. So a decision can be taken then on the relative success of different treatments. So here the difference between the cost is £500 and the difference between the QALYs is 2.6. So here the ratio is £192 per QALY gained. Now that's actually quite cheap. So a decision in the UK might be taken on a basis of £20,000 to £30,000 per QALY, which is suggested by for the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence to be a limit for the intervention to be cost effective. Why in the UK we often occasionally hear heartbreaking stories of how somebody is denied treatment for a rare form of cancer because the treatment is deemed to be too expensive. So the disability adjusted life year, on the other hand, is a measure of overall disease burden expressed as the cumulative number of years lost due to ill health. So it starts again with birth on the left. You can see these light blue dashes indicate some minor disease lived through the life, but when we get to the big bar of light blue where it says disease or disability, the person becomes unwell and then dies early from their condition. So you can see then that the DALY becomes interested in the condition once it is realized and becomes obvious and when treatment starts. So it accounts for the years of life lived with a disability and the life years lost to premature death, whereas the QALY does not consider the life years lost due to premature death. So we've got a quick economic example here. So this is for some condition. We've used the weighting for onset diabetes, but I wouldn't read too much into that. So for somebody born, say, in 1955, after 45 years, they develop type 2 diabetes, and without treatment, they live for that with 5 years and eventually die 30 years earlier than they might expect. So a DALY then would have a weighting of 0.2 for the years of life lived with type 2 diabetes multiplied through by the 5 years that they experienced it, and then because the years of life lost then is 30 years. Now let's say that then receive some treatment where they only need 2 years of treatment, and maybe with some lifestyle changes they're able to eliminate type 2 diabetes for their life, so they continue to live until 2010 before dying of something else. So their years of life lost is the 2 years multiplied by the 0.2 weighting, and then we account for only 25 years lost as opposed to 30 in the previous example. So with the treatment here, the averted DALYs is 5.6 years. So at the moment, DALYs are still a methodological and thought experiment, but they're used as the preferred metric to estimate health impacts in the global burden of disease studies, and whereas QALYs are used here by the UK, Ireland, Thailand, and so on. It's quite a number of countries that use QALYs here. But in terms of indoor air quality, the advantage that DALYs give us is that we can sum all the different health impacts together, and that there is more data on exposure to indoor air quality values. And this then led the LBNL laboratories in the US to review 70 studies reporting on indoor air pollution concentrations in the US and other countries with similar lifestyles. They considered 277 chemical air pollutants in total, And they calculated the annual health impact of pollutants, considering the total intake in houses in addition to the intake in other environments. So the in-house inhalation of air with the mean exposure from the studies was considered relative to the theoretical case of no inhalation at all. So that makes the DALY's gained to be, it would assume that the change required would be to remove all pollutants at all from the indoor space. So the inhalation is weighted to the US population, so there would be differences in other populations in the chart that I'm just about to show you, but they are likely to be very similar in countries with a similar lifestyle, such as the UK and those in Northern Europe. So what we've got here is a plot which came out in 2012. It was run by Max Sherman, published by Jenny Logue, and appears in a number of AIVC documents. So on the y-axis it's a log scale. So each line up indicates 10 times more harm than the line below. And we've got DALYs lost per 100,000 persons is the metric. So they're listed in order of harm, and the top 15 are given here. So you can see then that PM2.5s come out as more harmful than secondhand smoke from tobacco smoking by an order of magnitude. Then come radon for smokers exclusively, and then formaldehyde and acrolein. And a little bit lower radon for non-smokers, and then ozone. Now you'll notice then for ozone we have two median values given here, and that's because two different approaches were used. You'll notice for acrolein, for example, the magnitude of the confidence intervals is enormous. But what's interesting about this is you can start to say, well, it looks like PM2.5s are more dangerous than any other pollutant. We should start there because we'll get the biggest bang for our buck. We can tell secondhand smokers to go and smoke outside. We can implement radon measures that we know are done an awful lot about. And that then leaves us with formaldehyde, which is likely to be consistently emitted in most spaces and may require a completely different treatment than PM2.5, which tends to be emitted by human activities. So one is sporadic, one is fairly consistent, so two different treatments perhaps. And I think then that this is extremely intuitive, and my PhD student, Gioberti Morantes Quintana, who helped produce these slides, is seeking to update this plot as we speak with up-to-date epidemiological data. Okay, so I'm nearly out of time. I am out of time. Well, I want to return then to our thought experiment. And I think it would be fairly straightforward to argue that perhaps the harm caused to these two different people in the same space, breathing the same air, is probably different. As a quick example here, let's say that it's a rather crude example, but let's say that as a result of being in this mixture of air for a year, both people contract asthma and then die after a year. The number of disability adjusted life years for the 8-year-old and the 80-year-old are vastly different. And the DALY does allow us to consider that, no matter how extreme this example may be. So in summary then, the new Annex 86, led by Yuli Leverge, is starting to think about this in its first subtask, and ASHRAE 62 have also started an indoor air quality working party thinking about this too, but we're still quite a long way off using DALYs as a useful and best practice measure. They've got to be robust to avoid litigation. They must be combined with appropriate diagnostic procedures. So if they're going to be linked to certain priority contaminants like those I've shown in the chart, then we've got to tell people how to measure them. They can't be a barrier to innovation. They can't help mean that we use too much more energy. And at the moment, we're only thinking about physical health and not mental health. And then when people don't comply, what do we do? So it's going to require significant multidisciplinary study and collaboration, and there is a significant need to involve various stakeholders to ensure their support. Having said that, I will round up. Thank Gioberti again, and then hand over to my friend and colleague, Pavel Vargorki.